Jack adjusted his footing on the creaky attic floor, his flashlight casting long shadows across the cluttered boxes and dusty relics of a past he barely recognized. His mom had always been tight-lipped about their family history, and Jack, for most of his 17 years, hadn't minded. But something changed recently. A gnawing curiosity about who his father was had started to dig its roots into his mind. The attic, filled with untouched memories, seemed like the only place he might find answers. Then, beneath a pile of old blankets, his hand brushed against a slim, worn album. The cover was a faded blue, and Jack's heart quickened as he flipped it open, hoping to see some familiar faces. At first, there were just generic family photos, relatives he'd met once or twice. But then he turned the page and saw it. A photo of his mother, Sarah, much younger, but undeniably her, standing beside a man who looked strikingly familiar. Jack squinted, leaning closer, his flashlight fixed on the man's face. A chill ran through him. The man had his eyes, his nose, even the same faint dimple in his left cheek. Jack's hands shook as he studied the photo, flipping it over to look for clues. Nothing. Just a date scrawled on the back in his mother's handwriting. "This has to be him," Jack whispered to himself. He snapped a picture with his phone, slipping the album back under the blankets. Back downstairs, the photo weighed heavily on his mind. For years, his mother had been reluctant to talk about his father, only saying that he'd left before Jack was born. It had been enough when he was younger, but now, seeing that photograph, it was like he'd been given a window into a past he'd always wanted to know, but had never dared ask. He waited until after dinner, his palms sweating as he finally worked up the nerve. "Mom," he started cautiously, his voice barely a whisper. "I was going through some old stuff in the attic. I found a picture." Sarah looked up, her face carefully neutral. "Oh, there was a man with you," Jack continued, watching her closely. "I think he looked like me." "Mom, was that my dad?" The color drained from Sarah's face, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Jack, we've talked about this," she said firmly, her tone final. "Your father. He isn't someone you need to worry about." Jack's stomach twisted. He'd expected some kind of reaction, but her shutting him down so quickly only made him more desperate for answers. He nodded, feigning acceptance, but his resolve only strengthened. If his mother wasn't going to tell him, he'd find the truth himself. The next morning, Jack couldn't shake the image of that photograph. At school, he hardly listened in class, replaying the conversation with his mother over and over in his head. His frustration grew as he thought about her reaction. She had dodged his questions as if he were asking about a stranger, not his own father. When he got home, he paced his room, his mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. He knew he couldn't let it go, not after seeing that photo. Determined, he sat at his computer and began searching local records and social media, hoping for any sign of the man in the picture. It wasn't long before he hit a wall. He didn't know the man's name, just his face, and after hours of searching, Jack felt defeated. He shut his laptop in frustration, ready to admit defeat, but something inside him refused to let go. A few days later, Jack decided to ask around town. His small community was close-knit, the kind where everyone seemed to know each other's business. He stopped by the local diner, where he recognized an elderly woman who had been a friend of his grandmother. She greeted him warmly, and after some small talk, he brought up the photograph. "Do you remember anyone my mom might have dated years ago?" The woman's expression changed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sarah never talked much about her personal life," she said, her tone cautious. "But there was a man, now that you mention it. He wasn't from around here, though." Jack's pulse quickened. "Do you know his name?" She shook her head. "I just remember he showed up one summer, and then was gone just as fast. Can't say I know much more, but maybe someone else around town remembers." Jack thanked her and left, feeling both hopeful and frustrated. He knew he was close, but every answer seemed to lead to more questions. That night, as he lay in bed, he replayed the woman's words in his mind. "Not from around here," she'd said. It was a small hint, but it was all he had. Jack's search for answers continued obsessively over the next few days. He spent every free moment combing through online forums, local records, and social media pages of people he barely knew, hoping for even the smallest connection to his father. But the more he searched, the more elusive the truth seemed to be. One afternoon, he returned to the diner, hoping to run into someone who might remember more about his mother's past. As he sat, sipping a coffee he barely tasted, he noticed an older man sitting a few booths away. Jack recognized him from around town and decided, on a whim, to approach him. "Excuse me, sir," Jack began, nervously shifting from one foot to the other. "I'm sorry to bother you, but do you remember anything about my mom? Maybe from before I was born." The man looked up slowly, squinting as he seemed to recall. Sarah's boy, aren't you?" he asked, a faint smile creasing his face. "Haven't seen her much these days. She used to keep to herself. But there was someone she used to be close to." Jack's heart pounded. "Do you know who he was?" The man shook his head. "Not his name, no. But I remember that summer. He was tall, dark hair, had a quiet way about him. They'd sit at the park for hours, talking like the world didn't exist." "Did he live around here?" "No. I reckon he was just passing through." The man tapped his chin thoughtfully. "But I remember he was renting a room from Mrs. Miller. Maybe you could ask her if she remembers more." Jack thanked him and hurried out, his mind buzzing with the new lead. He made his way to Mrs. Miller's house, heart pounding with anticipation. She was kind enough to speak with him, but her memory of the man was faint at best. Still, she mentioned that he was quiet and reserved, someone who kept to himself. Back home, Jack was left with yet another fragment of the puzzle, but still no solid answers. He felt the frustration building, a helplessness that gnawed at him. Each clue seemed to pull him further into a maze of uncertainty. That night, he lay awake, wondering if he was chasing shadows. The next day, while walking home from school, Jack's attention was caught by a figure at the edge of town. He squinted in the afternoon sun, the man's familiar profile making his heart skip. The resemblance was uncanny. He looked like the man in the photograph, only older. Jack's feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the stranger. As he approached, the man looked up, his gaze locking onto Jack's. For a tense moment, they stared at each other, the silence thick and charged with an unspoken recognition. "You're Sarah's boy, aren't you?" The man finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Jack's mouth went dry. "And you're him." The man in the photo. The words barely came out, a mixture of disbelief and awe tingling through him. The man nodded, offering a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "David," he introduced himself, extending a hand. Jack shook it cautiously, feeling a strange sense of connection and distance at the same time. Are you my father?" Jack asked, the question tumbling out before he could stop himself. David's expression faltered, a mix of sadness and resignation in his eyes. "I can't answer that, son," he said quietly. "But I think you deserve to know the truth. Ask your mother, Jack. She's the one who holds all the answers." Frustrated, Jack felt his hopes slip away as David turned to leave. "Wait," he called after him, desperation in his voice. "Why won't you just tell me?" David paused, glancing back with an unreadable look. "Sometimes, Jack, the truth has to come from the right person, and that person isn't me." With that, he walked away, leaving Jack standing in stunned silence, his mind whirling with more questions than ever before. The next morning, Jack was determined. After his encounter with David, he knew he couldn't hold back any longer. The need for answers outweighed any fear or hesitation he felt. As soon as he returned home from school, he found his mother in the kitchen, the familiar sound of chopping filling the air. "Mom," he began, his voice firmer than before. She looked up, sensing the urgency in his tone. "I saw him. The man in the photo, David. He told me you had answers." Sarah froze, the knife pausing midair. Her face paled, and for a moment, Jack thought she might deny everything again. But then she sighed, placing the knife down and wiping her hands on a towel. "Jack, this isn't something I wanted you to find out this way. So, It's true. Jack pressed. He's my father. Sarah's shoulders slumped as she nodded. Yes, David is your father. The words hung in the air, and Jack's chest tightened as the truth settled over him. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you lie all these years? Sarah's gaze softened with regret. I didn't lie, Jack. I just never told you. I thought it was better this way. David wasn't around. He couldn't be there for you the way you needed. But why? Jack's voice was barely a whisper now. Why wasn't he around? Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mix of emotions. David was complicated. He had a past, things he was running from. I didn't want you caught up in that. I wanted you to have a safe, stable life. Jack's mind swirled with conflicting feelings, anger, betrayal, a strange sense of relief. He'd always felt a void, but now he realized it was one his mother had tried to protect him from. So you thought it was better to just pretend he didn't exist? It was better than having you grow up with uncertainty and disappointment, she replied softly. I know it's not what you wanted, but it was the best I could do. Jack nodded, though the answers didn't bring the closure he had hoped. He left the kitchen feeling both closer to his mother and further from her than ever before. With the truth about his father out in the open, Jack felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. The initial shock had passed, but he still had questions. He decided to dig deeper, wanting to understand David's background and what had kept him away. After school, he went to the town's records office, searching for any public information on David. He combed through old newspapers, obituaries, and even minor legal documents, piecing together fragments of his father's past. In an old article, he finally found something. David had been involved in a car accident that resulted in a lengthy legal case. The case didn't detail much, but the incident seemed serious, and Jack sensed this might be part of the complications his mother had referred to. He sat back, trying to make sense of it all. The accident had happened shortly before his birth, and Jack realized that this event might have kept David from returning to his life. But why had no one ever told him about it? Why had his mother chosen to hide this part of David's past? That evening, Jack returned home, his mind swirling with fragments of a life he had never known. He felt closer to understanding, yet still haunted by the mystery surrounding his father's choices. It was like standing on the edge of an endless void, unsure of how deep it went. Jack knew he couldn't keep piecing things together on his own. He needed to confront David directly, not just to get answers, but to see for himself who his father really was. On Saturday morning, he found David's address in a nearby town and took the first bus out, his heart racing the whole way. When Jack arrived, he hesitated outside the modest apartment complex. Finally, he gathered his courage, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the door. After a few tense moments, David opened it, his expression surprised, but not entirely unwelcoming. Jack, David said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. I didn't expect to see you here. Jack entered, taking in the sparse furnishings and worn-out feel of the place. It was a far cry from the picture he'd conjured in his mind. Sitting on the edge of a well-worn couch, Jack faced David, meeting his gaze. I need to know why you weren't there, Jack began, his voice unsteady. Mom told me about you, but I need to hear it from you. David sighed, his expression darkening. I had a choice to make back then, he said slowly. I got involved in something, a mistake that spiraled out of control. After the accident, I was afraid. I didn't know how to face you or your mother with what I'd done, so I stayed away. Jack listened, a wave of anger and empathy washing over him. But you never tried to come back, not once. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, David replied, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't want you to grow up with someone like me, a man who made bad decisions and brought trouble. But I see now. I see that it hurt you in a different way. Jack felt a surge of emotion. He'd spent his life wondering what kind of person his father was, and here he was, flawed, uncertain, but human. I just needed to know, Jack whispered. Needed to know why you left. David nodded, his expression pained but understanding. I know I failed you, Jack, and I can't change that. But I want to make it right, if you'll let me. They sat in silence, the distance between them shrinking, but still tangible, each man absorbing the impact of the other's words. Returning home that evening, Jack felt as if he carried the weight of his father's story with him. But there was one more conversation he needed to have before he could find peace. He sat down with his mother, his mind still racing with everything David had told him. "Mom, I talked to him," Jack said softly. Sarah looked up, her face tense, yet braced for the conversation. "What did he tell you?" He explained about the accident, about why he thought it was better to stay away. Jack's voice was thick with emotion, but he said he thought he was protecting me by not being around. "Did you know that?" Sarah's eyes softened, her expression a mixture of sadness and regret. "Yes, Jack. I knew about the accident. I knew why he left. Then why didn't you ever tell me?" Jack's voice rose, his frustration and hurt bubbling to the surface. "You could have told me the truth instead of leaving me to wonder all these years." Sarah closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I was afraid, Jack. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd be disappointed, that you'd want something I couldn't give you. I thought if I could keep things simple, you'd have a better chance at a normal life." Jack fell silent, the anger ebbing as he took in her words. He'd always seen his mother as unyielding, but now he saw a woman who'd made difficult choices out of love and fear. "So, you were protecting me too?" he asked, his voice quiet. Sarah nodded, reaching out to hold his hand. "I did what I thought was best, but I know now that maybe I should have given you the choice. I just didn't want you to feel the same hurt I did." Jack squeezed her hand, a new understanding settling between them. The pain of the past was still there, but for the first time, he felt the beginning of healing. The days after his conversations with David and his mother felt like an emotional whirlwind for Jack. He'd spent his entire life wondering who his father was, only to discover he was a man marked by regret and questionable choices. For the first time, Jack faced a question he hadn't anticipated. Who was he, now that he knew where he came from? He found himself drifting through routines without focus, his thoughts constantly circling back to the newfound truths. He spent hours replaying his encounters with David, trying to reconcile the image he had built in his mind with the real man he'd met. This internal conflict weighed heavily on him, clouding his sense of self. One afternoon, Jack wandered into the town library, searching for some kind of escape in the pages of books. But even as he tried to read, his eyes kept drifting over to the mirrored wall nearby. Catching his own reflection, he felt a strange detachment, almost as though he was staring at a stranger. "Who am I, really?" he whispered to himself, voicing a question that lingered uncomfortably within him. He had his father's eyes, his mother's resilience, but somewhere along the way, he had built an identity around assumptions that now felt fractured. Was he just the product of his parents' choices, or did he have the power to redefine himself? Jack felt both lost and compelled to find his own path, a journey that, for the first time, had nothing to do with anyone else. That evening, he returned home with a sense of quiet determination. He didn't have all the answers, but he felt a shift within himself. He was beginning to understand that his identity wasn't solely defined by the actions of others, but by the choices he would make moving forward. With his thoughts beginning to settle, Jack decided to reach out to David again. It was strange, seeking a connection with a man he just met, yet already shared so much history with. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but he knew he wasn't ready to close that door. They met at a small park on the outskirts of town. David arrived first, sitting on a bench by the pond, his expression thoughtful. Jack joined him, and for a few moments, they simply sat in silence, both aware of the tentative bond between them. Finally, David spoke. "I'm glad you reached out, Jack. I didn't think you'd want to see me again." Jack shrugged, unsure of his own feelings. "I don't know what I want yet," he admitted, his honesty surprising even himself. "But I think I want to know you, at least a little." David smiled, his face softening. "That's all I can ask for. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm here now. I won't be here for you, if you'll let me." They spent the afternoon talking about simple things, music, hobbies, favorite foods. Nothing groundbreaking, but each moment felt like a step forward. Jack noticed how David listened attentively, his expression a mix of pride and regret as he absorbed every detail. As they parted ways, David looked at Jack with a sincerity that was hard to ignore. "You're a good kid, Jack. Stronger than I ever was. I hope you know that." Jack nodded, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't expected. Building a bridge to his father wasn't going to be easy, but he felt ready to try, one small step at a time. The budding connection between Jack and David began to shift the dynamics at home. Sarah had always been Jack's constant, his anchor, but now, for the first time, she felt a distance growing between them. Jack noticed it too, the subtle tension filling the silences at the dinner table, and the way his mother's gaze lingered on him with a mixture of worry and sadness. One evening, after another silent dinner, Jack decided to break the tension. "Mom, why won't you talk to me about him?" he asked, looking up from his plate. "It feels like you're avoiding it." Sarah hesitated, setting down her fork. "Jack, it's not that I don't want you to know him. It's complicated. I spent so many years protecting you from that part of my life, and now it feels like it's all unraveling." "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom," Jack said softly. "I can handle the truth, and I want to know both of you." Sarah sighed, the weight of her emotions visible. "I understand that, Jack. I do, but I can't help feeling like I'm losing you to him." Jack reached out, his hand covering hers. "You're not losing me. I just need to know who I am, and part of that means knowing where I come from. But that doesn't mean you're any less important to me." They sat in silence, a fragile understanding settling between them. Sarah nodded slowly, a small smile breaking through her sadness. "I know, Jack. I'm still getting used to all this, but I'll try to be more open." The tension eased slightly, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. Jack knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter for his family, a chapter marked by acceptance, forgiveness, and the complex ties that held them together. A few days later, Jack met with David again, eager to continue piecing together his father's past. They walked through the park, their conversation light, until Jack asked a question that had been on his mind. "Why did you stay away all those years? Was it really just the accident?" David's expression darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "No, Jack. It was more than that." He hesitated, then continued, "Your mother. She didn't just hide me from you. She actively pushed me away." Jack's heart sank, confusion and anger bubbling to the surface. "What do you mean?" David sighed, his voice laced with bitterness. "After the accident, I tried to come back. I wanted to be there for you, but your mother wouldn't have it. She said I wasn't fit to be in your life, that I'd just bring trouble." Jack felt a betrayal he hadn't expected. He'd always seen his mother as his protector, but now he wondered if her protection had been more about control than care. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" David shrugged, a look of sadness in his eyes. "Maybe she thought she was doing what was best for you. Maybe she didn't want you to see me for who I was back then. But I changed, Jack, and I wanted to come back." As Jack walked home, his mind spun with questions. The idea that his mother had kept him from his father, had deliberately cut off the chance of a relationship, shook him deeply. He knew he had to confront her, to get to the truth of what had really happened. That night, as he stepped through the door, his mother was waiting for him, her expression wary, as if she sensed the storm brewing between them. The confrontation that Jack had been dreading finally came to a head that evening. Sarah was sitting in the living room, her face tense as he entered. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of David's words still fresh in his mind. "Mom, I need to know the truth," he began, his voice steady but his heart racing. "Why did you push him away? Why didn't you let him come back?" Sarah looked away, her hands twisting together. "Jack, I did what I thought was right for you. David wasn't. He wasn't someone I could trust with your future. But he told me he tried to come back." Jack pressed, his voice sharper than he intended. "You never even gave him a chance." Her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "You don't understand, Jack. I had to make difficult choices. I was young, alone, and scared. And David, he wasn't ready to be a father back then, but he is now," Jack said quietly. "And I have a right to know him, don't I?" Sarah's face softened, but her pain was clear. "I was trying to protect you, Jack. Maybe I didn't handle it the right way, but but I thought I was doing what was best." Jack's anger melted into a deep sadness as he looked at her, seeing the mother who had sacrificed so much for him, but who had also made choices that left scars. He understood now that there were no easy answers, no clear villains, just people doing their best with what they had. "I don't want to lose you, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I can't ignore him either." They sat together in silence, the weight of years of hidden truths pressing down on them. In that quiet moment, Jack realized that he needed to make peace with both his mother and his father if he was ever to find peace within himself. After the intense confrontation, Jack felt a strange sense of clarity. He didn't want his relationships with either of his parents to be defined by resentment or regret. Determined to mend the fractured bonds, he decided to talk to his mother and David individually, hoping to find a way forward. The next day, Jack asked his mother if they could go for a walk. They strolled through town, the conversation starting slow and cautious. "Mom," he began gently, "I know you tried to protect me. I get that now. But maybe you can trust me to make my own decisions from here on out." Sarah nodded. Her expression softened. "You're right, Jack. I've held on too tight because I was afraid of losing you. But I don't want to stand in your way. If knowing David is what you want, then I'll support you." Jack felt a wave of relief. He reached for her hand, grateful for her willingness to understand. They walked in silence, a mutual understanding forming between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Later that afternoon, Jack met with David once more, this time with a clear purpose. He looked at David, seeing a man who had his flaws, but who was trying to make amends. "I'm willing to give this a chance," Jack said firmly, "but I need you to be honest with me. No more secrets." David nodded solemnly, his voice quiet. "I understand, Jack. I want to make this work too, for both of us." They talked not just about the past, but about the future, about how they could rebuild their relationship one step at a time. Jack felt a new sense of hope, a possibility for a future where he could embrace both parts of his family without feeling torn. With his relationships with both his mother and David on the mend, Jack felt a weight lifting from him. He'd spent so long haunted by questions, but now he felt grounded in the truth. Knowing where he came from didn't erase the pain, but it gave him the foundation to start anew. One afternoon, Jack sat alone in his room, reflecting on the journey he'd been through. He realized he wasn't defined by his parents' choices, by his father's absence, or his mother's secrets. Instead, he was his own person, capable of making choices that would shape his future. To symbolize this new chapter, he decided to invite both Sarah and David to dinner, wanting to bring them together in a gesture of acceptance. It was an idea that felt both comforting and terrifying, but Jack knew it was a necessary step for him to truly move forward. That evening, the three of them sat around the table, the atmosphere a bit awkward at first, but warm with shared understanding. Conversation came slowly, each of them carefully treading new territory. Jack watched his parents interact, seeing them in new light, not as adversaries, but as two people connected by a shared past and a mutual love for him. By the end of the evening, they were laughing and talking openly, the tension of the past melting away. For the first time, Jack felt that he belonged, not just as his mother's son, not just as David's son, but as his own person, finally free of the shadows of secrets. In the days that followed, Jack found a new rhythm in his life, one where his past didn't define him, but informed him. He continued building a relationship with David, finding comfort in knowing his father, flaws and all. At the same time, his bond with his mother grew stronger, marked by a new openness and mutual respect. Jack realized that family was complex, woven with mistakes, misunderstandings, and redemption. But he also understood that family was about choosing to be there for one another, even when it wasn't easy. His parents had each made mistakes, but they'd also shown him a love that was complicated, yet undeniably real. As he stood on the porch one morning, looking out at the familiar streets of his hometown, Jack felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew he could face it with a confidence he hadn't felt before. He was no longer defined by his past, but by his own choices, by the family he had come to accept and embrace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been worth it. Jack had found peace, not in answers, but in acceptance. He was ready for whatever came next.